Okay, I am going to introduce I have the privilege of introducing all of these amazing speakers today. Dr. Tracy Giroccowick is an occupational therapist and professor who received her Bachelor of Science degree in occupational therapy in 1991, a Master of Science in Rehabilitation Medicine, occupational therapy pathway in early childhood specialization in 1995, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in special education and rehabilitation medicine in 2003. Dr. Giroccowick's expertise is in pediatric assessment and intervention for children with developmental disabilities and therapeutic interventions for vulnerable populations. She has extensive clinical experience across pediatric practice settings, including early intervention, public school, and outpatient clinics. She has a clinical specialty with children who experience fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and holds a position, which she's held for 25 years, with the University of Washington Fetal Alcohol Syndrome Diagnostic and Prevention Network, where she is a part of an interdisciplinary diagnostic and training team. Please welcome Dr. Tracy Giroccowick for her presentation today. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here with all of you today. I just want to start from a place of gratitude, and my gratitude today is for spring and the cherry blossoms, which are peaking on campus. So I hope you have that moment of gratitude today for whatever it is that makes you find joy or what you're thankful for. Okay. We have 3 learning objectives today. We're going to talk about developmental frameworks for understanding sensory processing differences in young children. We're going to describe sensory processing patterns specifically in young children with prenatal substance exposure, and then talk about sensory-based interventions in the context of family-centered and relationship-focused interventions for young children affected by prenatal substance exposure and their family. And I think you've already heard some incredible ideas and interventions that have sensory components from our previous speakers. And so I hope I can deepen your knowledge and ability to consider how these types of interventions and approaches may be beneficial. And I'd also like to say that I can also appreciate that it's been a very full morning and that there's been a lot of exceptional information shared, and that you're all probably getting a bit hungry and tired from being online. I know there's some fatigue there, so hang in there. I know lunch is coming soon. So our first learning objective is to give us some ideas about developmental frameworks. How do we think about sensory-based interventions and sensory processing in young children? And when we talk about young children today, I'm focusing on children 0 to 5. I'd like to begin also in a place of acknowledging strengths. And so this is a quote by Winnie Dunn and colleagues, a well-known occupational therapist. A strengths-based approach invites us to consider each person's strengths and abilities, that everyone has knowledge about their individual circumstances to inform solutions, that people are resilient, that the environment is critical, and finally, that services be client and family centered. So sensory processing gives us a perspective on brain and behavior relationships. Sensory processing generally is defined as an interaction between the neurological processing of sensory inputs and behavioral responses. So this involves noticing, organizing, and integrating sensory input from the environment and the body, processing and responding to the input appropriately and in adaptive ways for learning and development. In early development, sensation is critical. So we know that optimal sensory, sorry, I'm getting a block on my screen here. That optimal sensory experiences and active participation promotes the healthy growth of the brain. And effective sensory processing and integration really does include that capacity to attend to what's meaningful in one's surroundings and pay less attention to or disregard what's irrelevant. It can support the child's ability to organize behavior, explore objects and surroundings, and gain greater control of their own behavioral states and regulation. And this is something, again, that's critical throughout development and is an evolving capacity, and how sensation and awareness and self-regulation grows and develops. Again, it's really a continuous process, and as children get older, it continues to foster and underlie higher level learning, cognitive and social interaction abilities. As an OT, I think it's also very important to be tuned into, what are kids doing every day in their lives? And so sensory processing patterns, it really does contribute to participation in those life activities, or can present barriers. So we have to think about how sensory processing and these brain behavior relationships facilitate the everyday activities of early childhood, such as playing with peers, eating, learning mealtime behaviors, sleeping, as well as learning self-care activities such as brushing one's teeth and taking care of one's own hygiene as those tasks emerge throughout development. So understanding sensory processing gives us a perspective on what might underlie or contribute to some regulatory difficulties that we observe in many kids affected by prenatal substance exposure. So children with sensory processing challenges may not notice or be easily overstimulated then by different kinds of sensations such as noise, touch, and or visual stimuli. And then the behaviors that we see are dysregulation, such as meltdowns or fussiness, prolonged crying, difficulty focusing or attending, not noticing or tuning out, as well as increased activity level, sometimes very, very intense seeking of different kinds of stimulation, as well as difficulty sitting still, sleeping, listening, and or following directions. So there are a lot of challenges that these sensory processing difficulties can contribute, but we know and understand that behavior is complex and there are many other factors that can contribute to these challenges as well. I want to share one model of sensory processing, and this model is from Duncan, and I'll acknowledge that in the field of occupational therapy, as an example, there are multiple ways to look at and understand brain behavior relationships surrounding sensation. But what Duncan has described two concepts of neurological threshold as well as behavior regulation strategies. And so these two concepts intersect and give us some ideas about how individuals respond to and react to different kinds of sensation. And so she uses the concept of neurological thresholds. Again, so this is how the brain is responding to levels of stimulation from one's body and one's surroundings. So individuals with low thresholds will respond quickly and often over-respond to different types of sensory input, whereas those with high thresholds, they may fail to detect or not notice stimulation as readily. And then she talks about passive and active behavior strategies. So these are then how individuals cope or respond to different kinds of sensory input in their surroundings. And those with active responses tend to do something about it. They'll seek more. They'll seek intensity because their brain needs it, or they might avoid high stimulation environments. Those with passive regulatory strategies, they might have a harder time leaving uncomfortable situations. So thus, again, that impacts their ability to cope because they're unable to recognize or choose an adaptive coping mechanism to manage some of that sensory input. And I appreciate Dunn's model of sensory processing with this population for 3 reasons. One is that she normalizes sensory processing patterns as something we all manage and deal with in our daily lives. So we act on sensory preferences that give us pleasure or that calm us down. We avoid sensory situations that might feel aversive or uncomfortable for us. And we all do that to some degree. It's often certain populations of children, such as those with developmental disabilities, as well as adults. And again, individuals with prenatal exposures might be operating outside of the typical range in a lot of these areas. And thus it really presents different kinds of challenges in daily lives. And then there's also the idea that these behaviors impact our daily lives, and we must pay attention to them. And she gives us options for how to intervene in daily life activities around different sensory processing differences or preferences. The other framework I want to introduce as well is something that we use often, and I think, again, you've heard about this a little today, but we use it in occupational therapy a lot. We think about the person, we think about the environment, we think about the task at hand. So in regards to sensory processing and sensory behaviors as well as interventions, we need to think about, what aspects can we understand about the person, what aspects can we understand about the environment, and what aspects can we understand about the task, and the goodness of fit of all these things together. And this, again, promotes adaptive behavior or participation in the activity of choice, or again, breakdown in any one of these areas might provide us with ideas for where to provide interventions. And the last developmental framework or ideas that I want to be thinking about is that with young children, birth to 5 years of age, we are operating in the context of early intervention and early relationship. And so these concepts are not new to early intervention. And so it's important to recognize and understand that the identification of sensory processing needs and the use of sensory-based strategies for regulation, they have been integrated and typically are in early intervention programs, relationship-focused interventions, as well as trauma-informed approaches. And another acknowledgement is that, these early relationships are so important in early intervention. So attention to and support for parent-child relationships is critical in early intervention, and for all caregivers, as well as the caregivers who might be in treatment and recovery. So I'll move on to the second learning objective, and that is to share what we know about sensory processing patterns and the prevalence of these behaviors in young children with prenatal substance exposure. And again, an appreciation for what are these behaviors, what do they look like in everyday activities. And this is some research that my colleague, Misty Pruner, has done recently, really trying to understand caregiver perceptions of some of these behaviors. My child can be very messy at meal times. Baths don't always go well. He likes things certain ways, like how he's held. But we've just tried to adapt. He'll often hit his head on things repetitively, like a wall or a door. He hates bathing, rain, diaper changes. scared of the toilet, overfills his mouth or fills his mouth dangerously to the point of choking. My child is very driven and become overstimulated and distracted by her environment. She's hyperactive, causing her to fall or run into things. She struggles with sleeping well and needs to stay on a very consistent schedule to be successful. So again, these are some of the behaviors that we are honing in on and trying to understand in relation to sensation. So I want to share with you some of the data that we've recently looked at from the Fetal Alcohol Syndrome Diagnostic and Prevention Network. And this is some data from infants and toddler in relation to sensory processing. And this is a group of 93 infants and toddlers ages 2 to 42 months who were visiting our clinic and had confirmed prenatal alcohol exposure at any level. And I think it's important to understand that these children come in with very high levels of other pre- and postnatal risk factors, including polysubstance exposure. And the tool that was used to understand sensory processing behaviors is the infant toddler sensory profile. And this is an assessment tool that is completed by caregivers, and it's based on caregiver observation of sensory processing behaviors in daily lives. And so caregivers rank the frequency of behaviors in multiple sensory domains, such as responses to movement, such as responses to touch or sound. They rank them on a Likert scale in terms of the frequency with which they occur, from never to sometimes and to always or frequently. So there's a 5-point scale. And when we look at the outcomes from the sensory processing assessment, we see that there are patterns of sensory responsiveness as well as responses to specific areas of sensation. And what we have here is a tool then that ranks the outcomes as in one of 3 categories, as having definite differences in sensory processing, probable differences in sensory processing, or typical performance. And so the dark bars in this graph show the proportion of children, of those 93 children, that had definite sensory processing differences, so more significant challenges. And then we have the lighter bars here that show probable differences, and then the lightest bars indicate no differences. So I just want to point out a couple of things here. Across the board, we see that in most cases, almost half the kids have some probable or definite differences in all areas of sensory processing that are assessed by this tool. And we see some patterns of low registration behaviors, or not noticing sensory stimuli. And we also see some higher proportion of children with greater differences in response to auditory information. So just a brief take-home summary from that graphic. So atypical sensory processing was observed in a large proportion of this sample of infants and toddlers. And this is consistent with studies in other samples of young children with prenatal alcohol exposure and polysubstance exposure. And then 2 areas of impact were low registration auditory processing, but generally speaking, again, we see variability or impact in across all areas of sensation. And these 2 patterns around low registration auditory processing are consistent with some of the studies of preschool and school age children with FASD. And so I know that we're focusing on young children, but I also just want to share what those profiles of preschool and school age children look like, because their sensory processing challenges, they show up in early childhood. and they do persist, and you know, they can become more significant as children get older. And so this is from, again, a sample of children from the same clinical diagnostic clinic. This is 325 children who had a confirmed history of prenatal alcohol exposure, as well as experienced high levels of other pre and postnatal risks. And this assessment was done by another version of a tool by Dr. Winnie Dunn. It's the short sensory profile. And it's, again, what I have here is an example of the different kinds of behaviors that are assessed. And you see a sample of how movement processing behaviors are assessed, and then how the frequency of how often the behaviors occur are rated. And so, you know, similar to the graph that I just showed you, there's a breakdown of differences by sensory category. And while this tool doesn't extensively speak to some of the different patterns of responses, what we see here, again, is the dark bar below showing that there are very significant, we'll say there's a high proportion of children from this clinical population that shows definite differences in their sensory processing behaviors. So again, the dark bar, the slightly lighter bar here is that area of at risk or probable difference. And then we have a small proportion of children across this clinical sample who are not demonstrating any significant problems and showing relatively typical behaviors in these areas. So you can see here again, these two areas, trouble with sound processing, and then this category on the short sensory profile involves behaviors that are kind of a mix of being under-responsive or that low registration, and then some of those active behavior patterns of sensation seeking there put together. And so again, a bit more insight into what do those behaviors look like in, you know, daily life. Under responsive sensation seeking, these are behaviors where kids are seeking movement, seeking touch. They're dysregulated easily by movement, even though they need it. The auditory filtering is listening and attention challenges. Things that show up under the touch category are distress during grooming or self-care, as well as in social situations, difficulty standing close to others, and then in areas of taste and smell and being a picky eater. So in summary, of older kids, we see high rates of behavioral symptoms of sensory processing differences, consistent or more prevalent patterns of differences in auditory filtering and listening behaviors, as well as under-responsive and sensation-seeking behaviors. And then we also see some differences in over-responsiveness in some sensory domains. And the last bit of data I want to share with you here, this is prevalence and patterns of young children birth to 5 years. They're children of mothers who are receiving substance use disorder treatment, who are living in residential treatment. And this data was gathered as part of a project that was led by Therese Gran as the PI, and it was funded by SAMHSA. And there were some trauma-informed enhancements that were brought into a local residential treatment facility where mothers were living with their child, or if they were if they did not have their child in their custody, oftentimes the children, you know, were visiting and they were in that transitional stage. So again, it was a residential living situation of intensive treatment, but we were able to do some screening as well as a brief intervention in that setting. And this is data from infants and toddlers as well as preschoolers using the infant toddler sensory profile that I mentioned earlier, as well as another tool that we used for preschoolers. And the data here again shows that these children do have sensory processing differences and symptoms. Almost 3/4 of the infants and toddlers were showing these differences in then one domain or more, and then about 42% were showing differences in 2 domains or more. And then the children, as they moved into preschool, you can see that prevalence increasing somewhat at preschool age 3 to 5. There were 87% of the kids that were screened had greater than 1 domain of difference, and then almost 3/4 had challenges or differences in 2 or more domains. So again, I think all these data speak to these symptoms occur frequently, and they're very real in this population. And then why is that important? Because we also know that sensory processing challenges contribute to child-related parenting stress. And so this is just, I'll show you a graph in just a moment, and a sample of children that were receiving an intervention for some behavior challenges. These were a group of children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Child behavior regulation and sensory processing characteristics were the strongest predictors of child-related parenting stress. So these were over and above some other developmental factors, such as adaptive behavior and/or cognition, as 2 examples. And you can see here, this was measured by the Parenting Stress Index, and the Parenting Stress Index looks at child-related parenting stress, parent-related parenting stress, and life stress. So in this group of children, there were 52 of them 5 to 12 years old. The darkest bar here, which is greater than the 85th percentiles, indicate clinically elevated levels of stress. And you can see that the child-related parenting stress had the highest ratings of clinically elevated stress, even though, again, all families or most families were experiencing stress in many other domains as well. So I think, again, that impact of these symptoms and dysregulation, as we know, it can be very stressful parenting children. So again, these data just tell us, it reinforces the importance of providers having a working knowledge of sensory processing as another perspective to think about brain behavior relationships and understand behavior. We do see some patterns, but these patterns and profiles vary by individual and within individuals. And an important piece of this is that this knowledge can help reframe difficult behaviors and caregiver understanding of why those behaviors are happening, as well as guide intervention. So our third learning objective then is to think about, well, what can we do about these behaviors? How can we support development? How can we support families? How can we support learning? So we're going to talk about some different interventions. Again, the must is that we need to consider this in the context of family-centered care, relationship-focused interventions. So this means that interventions, need to be tailored to the child, tailored to the child within their family and caregiving systems, and fit within the different environments and activities that they may be doing on a daily basis. So again, in the context of early intervention, we know that early intervention is a very important protective factor. So detecting these symptoms early can contribute to early intervention supports. As I mentioned, we need to think about how relationship-based supports are being provided to support those important caregiver-child early relationships and attachment to caregivers. Early intervention best practices also are very routine-based, so they have to fit within the parents and within the child's, again, daily activities, and they need to be feasible in life and, again, be individualized. So when we talk about sensory-based interventions. What do we mean? There's a lot of different ways people can define sensory-based interventions or sensory approaches. Generally speaking today, when I present and talk about the interventions this morning, let's think about these tools as strategies of support. Strategies or supports for sensory modulation and regulation. They intend to help achieve a regulatory state of readiness as a foundation for learning and participation. And importantly, they're guided by how the type of sensation impacts the nervous system and the regulatory state. So there's some sensation, and we'll look at that in a moment, that are generally going to have more calming or inhibitory impacts on the nervous system, while others might be more alerting and excitatory. And many of these sensory-based interventions, they're rich in body-centered sensation. So there's some powerful behavior regulation components that can be more organizing to an individual, especially around movement, proprioception, and deep touch pressure. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And so I think, again, you've heard some ideas today about different kinds of interventions that might be sensory-based, that might be helpful for this population. And there are many possibilities out there. And what I would like to do, in addition to giving some examples, is also provide some information on, well, what are those characteristics? So the problem-solving aspect of choosing that goodness of fit becomes part of the process. And so there are certain types of sensation that have a more calming effect on the nervous system, and this would include deep pressure touch, neutral warmth, slower rhythmic movement, or soft, quiet music. There are other types of stimulation that are more excitatory, movement that is fast, that involves spinning, that can be much more alerting. Light touch or a tickle is very excitatory, as opposed to more of a deep touch pressure. Bright lights or invigorating scents can be excitatory as well. And then we have this category of organizing, which sometimes we call as heavy work. And so this is the idea that you are, working those muscles and those proprioceptives within the body. So that's very body-centered through pushing, pulling, climbing, or oromotor activities such as chewing, blowing, and sucking. And again, these types of activities with these sensory qualities or components tend to be more organizing to the nervous system. And you may wonder, well, what are some of those activities that have those properties? Oops, that went too fast. Again, here's some ideas around movement. So these heavy work activities, pushing and pulling, calming, linear swinging and rocking movement, again, can be more inhibitory. Alerting might be movement breaks and fast swinging or slides. Touch sensations or tools that might be more organizing and calming are the use of fidgets, small items held in the hand. There might be deep touch pressure, such as lap pads or huggables or body pillows, that may have a more calming or organizing effect. And then, like I just said, the light touch and tickles may be more alerting. Sound, there's ways to reduce sound from the environment through noise reducing headphones, white noise, rhythmical music, low volume, again, more calming and organizing, in contrast to loud or very upbeat music that would be alerting. And then some ideas around visual stimulation. You've heard some of these mentioned. Lighting can have an impact on the nervous system in terms of low lights being more calming, as well as pastel and muted colors. And then bright lights and bright colors like the color red or very busy environments can be very stimulating. So again, these are generalities, but I think what's helpful again is knowing and being able to analyze what kinds of activities have what properties, and in general, how that might affect a child's nervous system or behavior regulation at any time. Bringing back this other model that I showed you earlier, the person, environment, and task or occupation, this also is a framework for problem solving. And again, this helps us analyze the nature of the environment that the child might be in terms of the sensory load or the people, the level of stimulation. It also helps us understand and think about, what does assessment or knowledge of symptoms and sensory processing patterns, how does that help us understand the child? And then we think about the task demands. Is it what they're doing or the sensory load of the specific activity, such as brushing one's teeth, for example, which may have a high sensory load? How does that, impact the child's behavior in terms of tolerance to sensory input, as well as, where might that toothbrushing be completed? Is it, in the bathroom alone, or is it with multiple siblings when there's a lot going on in the morning? There's a lot of different things to analyze, and basically, this gives us some perspective on, again, what we consider the sensory load. And this is all about finding the goodness of fit, as well as being able to think about, where do you intervene? Do you change the environment? Do you change features of the task? Or do you give the child more tools and strategies for their own regulation? There's multiple combinations of approaches here. And so, again, how do we approach and what do we need to be thinking about as we apply these sensory-based intervention? There are elements of co-regulation, and so a big cue is understanding children's nonverbal and verbal behaviors that tell us about their state and how they're responding to. So that's going to be, again, an important part of the process. Learning which cues might signal for any child that's the behavior dysregulation or the sensory overload or some other type of state that indicates a sensory need. And then here's where we also bring in co-regulation with caregivers. I think we've heard earlier throughout the morning, I think we know this as well, that supporting the caregiver's ability to remain calm and connected is a critical part of the relationship, but as well as managing, daily routines. And caregivers also have sensory patterns and preferences that they should be aware of, or we may help individuals recognize. And so understanding what strategies a caregiver might use for their own regulation. When children are upset, they're loud and they're crying hard, and that can be a really hard type of sensory input to stay calm and regulated around. So how is a caregiver, experiencing their child's behavior in terms of their own sensory thresholds and their own patterns? And how do we incorporate that into, again, the co-regulatory coping that needs to happen? Because we do know that when a parent stays calmer or manages their own coping, they're able to better respond in a way that's helpful for their child. So some other strategies I just want to share here, again, do what makes sense. So we'll talk about safety, education, and environment, doing what's nurturing, structure and self-awareness, evaluation, and evidence. Safety is critical to be thinking about, and sensation has a powerful impact on the brain, and we must consider safety at all times. And with young children, we need to think about safety in terms of what's developmentally appropriate. We may have children in foster care, and there might be other factors in an environment that we just want to be aware of. Some of these interventions that are commercially available they just may not be safe and appropriate. So it's always thinking about safety first, and that's a big part of the goodness of fit. And when we think about safety, we might be using oral sensory input as a way to calm. And, pacifier is very important and appropriate for a young child. But then when a child gets older, how does that need for kind of oral sensory input for calming, how does that change into something developmentally appropriate, move beyond the pacifier and stay safe? So there's, tools out there, chewables, jewelry. These are things that, again, kids are putting in their mouth, and sometimes that can support regulation, but there are some safety risks. And so one needs to be really vigilant about what those oral tools are. Movement, vestibular input can have a strong effect on the autonomic nervous system. So sometimes, again, this can really elevate children's dysregulation quickly, even though they need the movement, and impulsivity around some of these movement activities. Extra supervision is needed to, be considered as a precaution. And then just around touch, awareness of responses to touch stimulation. We talked a little bit about light touch versus deep pressure touch. The light touch can be threatening and alerting, especially touch that someone's not expecting. And when we think about working with children and caregivers who may have been exposed to or experienced trauma in their life, touch applied directly by another person, that might be very uncomfortable. And, we need to consider how all of these approaches are not only safe from a developmental perspective, but also that they're safe from a trauma-informed care perspective and appropriate in that manner. So to the E here, education, this is a big part of understanding how sensation impacts the brains, sensation impacts the brain and behavior. And it's an opportunity to use sensory tools and strategies as a positive behavior support to enhance positive parenting strategies. And again, as a way to reframe negative or challenging behaviors. One reason for these behaviors may be, discomfort or aversion to a certain type of sensory input. And so, reframing it that way takes the onus off the child. And then these strategies, again, enhance parent coping and support, hopefully contribute to co-regulation and decrease parenting stress. So just knowing and having another explanation for behavior can be powerful. And environment is critical. And so we think about changes in the sensory characteristics of the environment. What can be changed, what can't be. Sometimes we can dim the lights, sometimes we can move to another space. Sometimes there isn't a choice. So the strategies and routines to facilitate coping in challenging environments may be necessary. And I love this example because this was camp one year with many families with children with FASD, and this was a very noisy dining hall. There was no other place to eat, so lunch had to take place there, but the parents had the knowledge and I'll say power to change the environment by adding the tennis balls to the chairs, and that softened the noise and the echo in the room and made that space more tolerable. And I think about environmental interventions, and another example is if the child has difficulty sleeping, we think about dimming the lights or thinking about what kind of bedding does that child sleep in. And a surprising example is that we figured out with one child that the pattern of a Disney characters in print on the comforter was very alerting and very stimulating for that child. So the child had difficulty letting go or attending to that stimuli at bedtime. And the solution was to change the comforter to something plain, the bed covering. So that is an example of again, really analyzing the full environment and the context of that behavior that they're having difficulty with, or that routine. And then I think about environment at another level as well. So, swimming and being in water can be a pretty therapeutic activity. But when we think about, well, what is the bigger context of that swimming pool? There's a lot of other children, perhaps families, noise. There's dressing before and after involving a lot of tactile stimulation. So, the swimming activity might be very therapeutic in certain times, but just remembering that there's sort of these before and afters and factors happening all around that can contribute to the sensory load. Sensation must also be nurturing. So there's evidence, I think you heard earlier, touch interventions such as skin-to-skin care, baby wearing, using a snuggly and infant massage can be therapeutic. And again, these interventions need to impact positive parenting. And I said earlier, it helps to promote awareness of emotional and behavioral cues in relation to sensation that would signal sensory overload or escalation. And then, when we have ideas about changing the environment and expectations, again, that takes the onus off the child and parent to change, and the environment, we can probably fully think of many ways to manipulate it. Back to the S, sensory diet. So this is, again, thinking about routines. Sensory experiences are part of daily routines and activity, and we need to incorporate the increase or decrease or modulation of those activities into the routines. Movement breaks, throughout the day as an example. Because there might be that difficulty with self-awareness or a quickly escalating response to a sensory input, using structure and appropriate supervision is very important, and making tools available to set ground rules. So adding structure through like a timer and using visual supports can be helpful. So the idea is that, not just allowing a child an endless amount of movement. We'd like things to be self-directed, but maybe setting a timer for like 5 minutes of an active movement activity, whatever's appropriate for that child. But then there's a cue, before that child begins to escalate. And so again, these external cues to help children learn their limits and kind of put parameters around what might be therapeutic for a child can be helpful. The routine-based interventions, here's an example of sensory stories. So adding visual supports, as well as thinking about the routine of toothbrushing and adding what I called heavy work or organizing sensory input and deep pressure input as a preparatory activity to get the child ready for toothbrushing. So again, these two activities here essentially or theoretically would calm the nervous system, and then they would be in a better state of readiness to accept the aversive challenge of toothbrushing. And the idea of having a visual support in this structure helps that child learn and see that routine and know what to expect. And then other examples, there's dressing. Again, is it the child or is it the clothing? There's adaptations that can be sought to change the environment or change the task in terms of changing the fabric or being aware of fabrics, cutting out tags. Grocery shopping in the community, grocery stores can be a very stimulating place to be, a hard place to be. So, thinking about what time of day is that happening? Is there a way to change the routine? Is there a way to change the sequence of that shopping errand, among other things in the activity? Those are the things to really analyze, because it may not just be the one place, but again, back to all the things that lead up to and come after a place that might be very difficult for a child and parent. We need to consider those chains of activities. And then school transitions is another idea. Again, knowing routines and activities happen in the home, community, and school, coming a little earlier. It might be quieter, less kids around, and that might be a really therapeutic accommodation for a child with a lot of sensory sensitivities to busier environments. Help them arrive in a smoother way and a calmer way for their day. Self-awareness and self-regulation. We know infants are developing that in tandem with their caregivers as co-regulators, and then, as they grow up and move into preschool, we expect them to be developing more independence in that management of some of their behavior. And there are some programs that teach self-awareness of regulatory states and also include sensory tools as strategies for that self-regulation. And you may know of these two programs, the ALERT program and the zones of regulation. There are others out there. These are more familiar. For me as an occupational therapist, and the ALERT program has been trialed with older children with FASD. And the idea behind these programs are to help children recognize their own states. Are they in a state where they are kind of, running slower? Do they need something to kind of, increase their level of alertness? Are they running just right so that they're ready to learn? Or are they kind of running in high gear and it's difficult to attend and they need to calm down? So there's different visuals for visual analogies for helping children learn these strategies. And then again, thinking about sensory tools that are age appropriate, developmentally appropriate, or appropriate for that environment to help a child regulate. That is really the aim of these types of programs. And I think the flexibility of how these are done can be beneficial. They can be offered one-on-one at an individual level. They can be done in small groups, or there are preschool classrooms or elementary school classrooms, for example, that are implementing these programs sort of school-wide or classroom-wide. So it's helpful to know what they're doing at that level, because again, these behaviors or these ideas and strategies can be generalized across the different home and school and community environments. And then the E here at the end of what makes sense is evaluating effectiveness, and just this is a trial and error process. So again, I think there's some problem solving that guides us, but it really is about trial and error, and we have to be aware of the specific goals that might be set and how a sensory-based intervention, amongst other things that might be done, is contributing or not contributing to that goal. I think there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of different sensory tools or approaches that could be used, and it could get kind of overwhelming, and many things could be trialed at once. And an appropriate pace is maybe to try something, see if it works, monitor it carefully, make sure it's safe, etc., before kind of stopping and or trying something, trying too many things at once. And just briefly also thinking about what is the evidence for the approach or the tool that you might be used. And so this again doesn't cover all of the different evidence out there, but just highlighting that indeed the ALERT program has been tested with school-age children, so slightly older than early childhood, with children with FASD. And again, this is designed to improve self-regulation and executive functioning with cognitive strategies and sensory-based tools and supports. And so there are some research findings that show improvements in parent-related child behavior and emotional regulation, as well as some positive changes at the brain-based level in regions critical for self-regulation. And then some moderate to strong evidence around touch-based interventions, such as the skin-to-skin care and kangaroo care, So this was from a comprehensive systematic review of interventions for children birth to 5 done by a group of occupational therapists. So some evidence to certainly support these touch-based interventions for better caregiver-infant attachments. And then likewise, we see some support for massage protocols that improve infant state regulation as well as reduce stress for caregivers. And there are certainly different protocols out there. Lastly, I think it's important to think about inclusive community environments. And so community participation is important and can be very hard to do for many reasons, but there are a lot of initiatives that are increasing inclusive community activities. And I think being able to seek those out or know where to find them can be helpful for families. There are initiatives in performing arts, movie theaters, grocery stores, playgrounds, even at CTAC, where there will be sensory friendly or relaxed performances, or times that one can go shopping where the capacity is reduced, or there's playgrounds that are more inclusive and cater to children with a lot of diverse developmental needs. And again, this is just an example of a map from the Pacific Science Center that shows caregivers or individuals who are attending that often very busy public place. Here's some guidelines to inform you about the sensory load of different places in the Science Center. So again, people can adjust their visit, adjust their routines around their visit in these outings that are sometimes very important to families, and hopefully that can lead to more success versus challenges like meltdowns or frustration because it's just too much. So I'm checking the time, and I actually I'm going to move forward and just again end with strengths and take questions. So begin with strengths and end with strengths. So what are some of the strengths? Again, my colleague Misty Pruner, 5 really frequently reported strengths among this caregivers reported amongst their children: happiness, sociability, love, curiosity, and cognition. So she brings a lot of happiness to our lives. The child is so lovable, and our child is a problem solver. So let's end on those strengths. And I have time for a few questions.
Yes, I think we'll take maybe just a couple of questions. People have been submitting their questions while you were presenting. And here's our first one regarding the success of interventions via telehealth versus in person. Many of the families I work with at the state that virtual therapy doesn't work for their child, yet with COVID, it is often done.
So, I mean, that's a great question. And, telehealth has been a reality for many, and I think it works for some better than others. But I think the idea of coaching and problem solving together, it's not going to work for direct interventions, but the facilitating, again, that problem solving, what's the behavior, knowing what the child's sensory or other developmental needs are. Let's talk about the challenge and let's figure out solutions. And maybe those solutions aren't for the behavior in the moment, but again, they are things to carry forward as part of the daily routine, or some of the other activities that the child has to do.
This is probably going to be our last question.
Okay.
When thinking about a clinic space, what strategies should be used for exam rooms, waiting room time that could be used when supporting a child and possibly caregivers who experience sensory disorders?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like I want to refer you to the Hope Rising Clinic. And I know there's some, I think I saw some names, but I think they probably designed that space, with a lot of people with sensory needs in mind. So, there's just ideas around space that is structured, not too stimulating, has some things to do that are developmentally appropriate, but as well as maybe some quiet and calm places. So I think there might be some more guidance out there in the community. And I see Catherine Zentel, who I know is an OT over there at Hope Rising. So I would suggest perhaps they might have some good ideas.
All right, well, thank you so much for your talk. And then if you can just maybe put in the chat that Hope Rising, and then I can attach it to the follow-up email for our participants. And I'll also attach your slides as well. We got that out before we got your slides, so thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Over